Hello, denizens of the internet. This is George, the Vanguard, and I'm about to talk to you guys in a short policy brief, our very first short policy brief, this time about labor unions. So let's talk about labor unions, and we're going to focus mainly on American labor unions, but we're going to discuss a lot of context surrounding them in history, and then how they apply today, and some both principled and pragmatic observations and opinions about labor unions. So let's think about, where did labor unions come from in the first place? What is a labor union? A labor union is generally a group of people united around a profession, or specifically a profession, sometimes in a specific workplace or more broadly across an industry, generally united to negotiate for higher pay, better benefits, and in many cases better work conditions, and also sometimes lower standards of employment, such that it's harder to fire them or penalize them. So that is a way of thinking about a labor union and what it does in a society, and particularly in an economy. Also, sometimes labor unions put together healthcare insurance plans of their own. Sometimes they have union halls and special events. Sometimes they do certification, and they try to do quality control, particularly in skilled professions. So they can do a lot of different things. Often they go on strike, unfortunately. So there's just a lot of that they do, but fundamentally the idea is that they are a bargaining unit, a collective bargaining unit, on behalf of the workers who are members of that union. So let's take a little bit of a walk down memory lane of history about where labor unions came from and what their origins were. So probably the first starting point I would pick would be the guilds of late medieval and Renaissance, and then post-Renaissance Europe. The idea would be that a skilled profession, like a stonemason or even a painter or something like that, would have quality standards that profession and its members would want to enforce. And also they would want to be able to control who entered the profession. There was generally an idea that you want to reduce competition for people who are already incumbent in the profession, but also, and I will give them some credit, there were standards that you did have to meet. They wanted to make sure that their profession was respectable and was effective at its job. So you would not want to have someone claiming to be a stonemason but truly incompetent at it. So there were sometimes a rudimentary form of certifications involved as well. And those were common all over Europe, especially, and that's really where the union tradition in America came from, was the guild system. And to an extent, some of it imported to America. It just kind of depended on when and what kind of professions came to America. But it is good to probably start the history in America with labor, with the railroad brotherhoods and the Knights of Labor. So in the 1870s through the early 1900s, there were unions for railroad workers. And the idea would be that they would bargain on behalf of railroad workers, but they also often made it a little bit easier for management to deal with a rather transient and diverse workforce. So in many cases, management was actually okay with having the unions, because at the cost of probably having to pay the workers somewhat better and give them better conditions, it also just made managing them easier, because the unions took on some management responsibilities and organization responsibilities. So some of those unions were the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Division, the Order of Railway Conductors, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, and the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen. And they wanted insurance and medical packages. They wanted work rules that involved seniority and grievances, procedures. A lot of standard fare stuff for unions today. They tended to be fairly moderate, at least by the standards of their time and today. They often fought off what they considered more radical rivals. Those would include the Knights of Labor in the 1880s, and then the American Railroad Union in the 1890s, and then they consolidated their power. And they were actually responsible for the Adamson Act, which provided 10 hours pay for an 8-hour day, which was an interesting policy. They were generally not super political, but they did support progressive presidential nominee Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin in 1924, and that was their big political moment. Now, a more radical labor organization early on started in 1869 in America. It's called the Knights of Labor, or was called the Knights of Labor. They often got involved in politics and education. They didn't usually like to have, at least early on under Terence Powderly, their founder, they didn't really like coercion as much. They tried to work with companies and tried also, though, just to encourage companies to, I guess in their view, enlighten them as to what they should be doing for their workers and what would be fair. However, they did go on some strikes. They had some gains, but really they had some level of diminishment in power after the Haymarket riot in May 1886 rather, in Chicago, and after they were on strike at the McCormick plant in Chicago, and some anarchists who weren't part of their group set off a bomb, probably. We think it was the anarchists. We still don't know for certain, but it killed 7 police and wounded many others, and that really damaged the Knights' reputation, made it look as though they were a bunch of anarchists, so they ended up fading by the 1890s. And the American Federation of Labor was another group led by Samuel Gompers. It was a federation of multiple different unions. It was not a union itself. And they worked on some legislation. They also went on different kinds of, or led, the groups did different kinds of strikes. They were a very diverse group. They did include black, or they did not usually include black men or women or unskilled workers, though, but they had all kinds of skilled workers. So it's important to note the history of the labor movement in the United States was often not very inclusive of racial minorities, and at the time that generally meant black people for the most part, and especially because of Jim Crow and such other restrictions and discrimination against black people, they especially were excluded from a lot of the gains. Women were often seen as threatening men's work and threatening the traditional social order. So it is important to note that although many of these unions did want economic changes and changes to the economic balance of power, they did not want to overthrow the social order. They did believe in the strength of families and such in many cases, and their concern for the strength of family meant that they didn't really want women in the workforce. There were more radical unions, the Industrial Workers of the World, which still exist today. They're called the Wobblies. They were derisively, they're often considered communist sympathizers, and in many cases have been. There were all kinds of different groups early on. There were coal miners, were actually some of the most violent unions in American history. They sometimes blew up their bosses. They sometimes blew up different kinds of things. To be fair, coal mining is a very dangerous profession. It is not something that I would say can be considered the safest job or the easiest by any means. So I can understand some of the frustration they experienced, but they were, I would say, one of the least acceptably behaved unions, or their different unions were some of the worst behaved in history. So I would definitely have to condemn them with special vigor. The other thing that I think is important to note is that over the time of history, there are multiple laws passed that gave unions a lot of power that I would argue they didn't deserve, and that I argue took away their possibility of acting as a legitimate arbiter for workers' interests, and took away their position as an economic actor or a collective bargaining unit and turned them into more of a federally sanctioned set of cartels. I would say probably the best example of legislation to that effect is the National Labor Relations Act. And that act basically, it was passed in 1935, known as the Wagner Act. It guaranteed the right to strikes, of private sector employees to organize. The problem was that it effectively meant that companies could not say that they're not going to employ union workers. And to me, here's the problem. Yes, of course, a company sometimes can exert its power by saying, if you're in a union, we're not going to employ you, and then scare workers away from unionizing. However, in this case, this basically just means unions are entirely protected. There's nothing you can do to stop a union from coming into your workplace. In fact, often it's even difficult today to organize a counter campaign. Now you can, but there are all kinds of things you have to do that, and all kinds of rules you have to comply with. You can't be seen as being too overly hostile to a union or whatever, even though a union, in most cases, is a clear negative for your company. Because here's the thing. Unions do not just advocate for worker benefits. Often what they end up doing are a few different things. First of all, they protect the lowest common denominator. So the worst of the employees who happen to join the union often are protected. Now, granted, if someone is truly egregiously bad, you can usually still fire somebody. In the public sector, it's very difficult to fire. In the private sector, it's still somewhat easier. And sometimes, if someone's just really that bad, it will even inspire shame in the union organizers, and they may just not defend that person just because that person is making them look bad. But rarely is that the case. Usually, if you're a bad employee and you're part of a union, you're protected. And that is not good for business. It's also just not fair to anybody, including the better employees. The other thing related to this is they compress wages. So, presumably, in a totally functioning market, you will pay the most for a good, product, and that includes good labor. That means somebody who does a mediocre job is going to get mediocre pay, if not get fired. But somebody who does a good job, an exceptionally good job, a better than average job, should get paid more. That would make sense, right? That you are compensating good product with good rewards. However, unions make that more difficult. For different job classifications, sometimes you can't even pay people different amounts, no matter how much more or less productive they are. In fact, to the extent that there is pay differentiation, it's almost always done by seniority. That means if you manage to stick around for 20 years, no matter how well or how poorly you're performing, you're paid more than maybe the person who's been there, not even just the brand new guy, but maybe somebody who's been there 5 years and has done an awesome awesome level of work for 5 years. It just simply doesn't matter, apparently, in the world of unions. So that's definitely, I think, one thing to note about the history of unions is that once the federal government started coddling them, it ended up creating a dynamic in which companies, I would say, were at an unfair disadvantage. And now, granted, there were some different rules passed in the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 that changed things a little bit, but it's important to note that the real crux of, I would say, labor's excessive power in America started out in the 1930s under FDR, and particularly with the Wagner Act. Now, labor unions have declined significantly in the private sector since then. Now, I believe it's something like 6 or 7% of private sector workers are unionized in America today, and that's a massive decline. It used to be closer to a third or more. But the reason that matters is that obviously it gives companies the ability to compete again. It means that you're not cutting into investors' profit margins excessively by just paying people more than their work is worth. You're not basically doing what a lot of unions do, which is to say that it's a union shop. In many cases, if you're a union, you can force companies to agree not to hire non-union workers. That means that if you're not part of the union and if you don't have an in, and historically, that meant that if you were black, if you were a woman, if you were unskilled, if you were not connected in some way, if you were an immigrant, often you couldn't even get a job. It wasn't just that you wouldn't get the union benefits, but you wouldn't even be eligible for employment. So that's another thing that I think is a benefit to the weakening of those unions as they were structured then. And then some understanding of why they have declined. So in many states, there are laws called right-to-work laws, which basically make union shop rules unacceptable. They basically say that an employer does not have to hire union workers. There's no way you can make a contract that forces union shops. That's just not acceptable in a right-to-work state. And many states today are right-to-work states. Probably one of the most famous cases of right-to-work is the state of Wisconsin, where former Governor Scott Walker really pushed right-to-work. He pushed reforms on public sector unions even, because usually right-to-work is a private sector type of policy. And a lot of that has played out, showing some improved economic growth in many of the states that adopted it, partly because of, and especially improved job growth at the lower end, because now a lot of jobs that otherwise just simply wouldn't have even been possible to support, given the expenses of handling a union job type structure, now could be supportable because they were cheaper to run, not just from paying the employees less, but also dealing with less expensive overhead of putting up with and mollifying a union, because unions are expensive to manage in their own ways, often regarding the expenses of negotiating contracts and the difficulty of having a legal team ready to deal with any kind of complaints the unions might put up. So that's sort of why it matters, and that's also how it happened. So it's important to note, though, that public sector workers are still heavily unionized. In fact, in many cases, it's effectively a union shop type environment in which you have to be part of the union to work in a lot of these public sector jobs. That would be, in many cases, municipal employees, police usually are all part of a union, firefighters, any kind of public employee. Obviously, white-collar employees are usually not, military is not, but a lot of the, especially local and state employees, and then some federal employees as well. And part of the problem that causes is that, well, we have a few problems. And this is and I want to make a very, very clear difference here. I don't always like private sector unions, but I think, I think that if they were, especially if we were able to get rid of some of the special protections that they have that I think create an unfair playing field that supports the unions against the companies and against, quite frankly, other workers, if we were able to get rid of a few of those rules, they could be legitimate economic actors. And in many cases where those rules are weaker, they are legitimate economic actors and legitimate bargaining units. And to me, that's part of an economy, that's fine. But with public sector workers, that is never the case, because public sector unions, and really labor unions in general, often get involved in politics. They often use part of their dues in order to donate to political campaigns that they like, etc. But public sector unions take it to another level because they are embedded, and because they generally have no such thing as right to work. Everybody in a lot of different professions, including, depending on the state you're in, teachers, municipal employees, police, firefighters, etc. Because they're all required to be part of it, all of them have to pay dues. And all those dues, some of them go to having all kinds of employees, some of them go to pay their fat cat union bosses, but some of them go to politics. And generally, almost always, they go to Democrats. So Democrats are elected with union money and have unions get out the vote efforts to them. And here's the problem, though. Who sets the wages for public sector employees? It's not a market economy. The public sector is not a market. It is, quite frankly, a command and control economy run by the government. And there's no competition. And that's fundamentally the problem that labor unions cause, is that they often eliminate competition, and in the public sector, that's even worse than it is in the private sector, where non-unionized companies can come in and break up the monopoly the unions have, and then sort of challenge them and make them reform. So the problem in the public sector is that when you pay to elect politicians, and when you get out there and get out the vote efforts, those are the people who are across the table from you when you're negotiating a contract. That means that, unlike in, say, a labor contract in the private sector, where the management is representing the shareholders and where the union is at least supposed to be representing the interests of the workers, that's adversarial, and that's how a negotiation should be. It's supposed to be give a little, take a little. It's supposed to mean that if you are the employer, you're representing your shareholders and their interests are represented. And if you're the union, you're supposed to be representing the workers' interests. However, in a public sector scenario, yes, technically your employer is the people of the United States, or the people of the state of Illinois, or the people of New York City, or whatever. But if those politicians are bought and sold by the union, they're across the table from their buddies. They're all going to make sure that the union gets as much as it possibly could ask for. And the taxpayer, that means the person who's paying the bill, they don't have a representative. They don't have a seat at the table in a public sector union negotiation. And that, to me, is a massive problem. Because, one, I think any negotiation should make sure that the stakeholders have a seat at the table. but especially when it is coercive, when it is taxpayer money, when this is money that, again, the other thing here is it's not competitive because they can always tax more, they can always issue more bonds. This is something that politicians can do, and short of having the taxpayers vote them out, which is, is easier said than done in many cases, there's nothing the taxpayers can do about it. They're going to be coerced to pay for unreasonable benefits. For example, in the state of California, if you're a public school administrator, you can get a pension that is 110% of your top salary. Let me repeat that, and let me rephrase that. That means that whatever you made, whatever you were earning at the end of your career, which presumably would be the highest that you ever earned, you get to take 110% of that as your pension. That's what you're paid not to work at the end of your career. How is that possibly fair, and how is that fair to the taxpayer? So I think it's important that we recognize those kinds of things, and that's not very rare at all. Illinois has similarly ridiculous pensions. The state of New York has similarly ridiculous pensions. All kinds of urban governments have those ridiculous pensions, and it's all because the public sector unions were able to negotiate these things with the politicians they paid to elect. And the other thing to note is that often this happens in the most corrupt states otherwise. Illinois, for example, I believe it may be before Bruce Rauner, who was an immediate previous governor. Before that, they had Rod Blagojevich, they had George Ryan, they had all these other governors. And so before Pat Quinn, who was the guy who came before Rauner, I believe the past three of the past four governors before him were in jail, or at least served some jail time. There was extremely serious corruption in that state, and there still is. And that's part of why not only do you get ridiculous pensions in Illinois, but believe it or not, I believe you have to work 20 years in a position, a state of Illinois job to get a pension. But if you work for 20 years in that state of Illinois job, you can retire, take your pension, and then get another job, work another 20 years, and take that pension. So think about that for a second. That means that, say I get a job in the state of Illinois at the age of, 22, and I work 20 years, and then I retire. I take my pension. Then I get another job, say at, that would be 42. Let's say that I wait till I'm 43, I get another job, and then I work another 20 years, and then I retire. I'm getting one pension from the time I'm 42 on, and then I'm taking a second public sector job, and then I'm retiring at maybe 62, 63, and at that point I'm taking two pensions, but I've also been taking that other pension for, again, the past 20 years before. One, there's no way you should be taking a pension after merely 20 years when you're in middle age. And two, there's no way you should ever have an opportunity to take two pensions. But that is how public sector unions work. They create these absurd incentives to milk the state for as much as it's worth, and that means really to fleece the taxpayer. And there's really no accountability, because whenever they have the ability to spend that much money, again, coerced money they get. They're not out there fundraising usually as much. Most of what they're doing is taking mandatory dues from their employees and using that for political activities. And, again, they're telling their employees how to vote and such. And sure, I'm fine with political activity, but they often don't face... They don't have the same level of difficulties as other political organizations do. And, in fact, they are basically able to do as much campaign fundraising as they wish. And it's interesting because all the campaign finance, opponents on the left who really believe that there should be no, massive fundraising, they never talk about unions. They never talk about the role unions play in big money in politics. And it's because if they did, they would be tarred and feathered by the labor movement or whatever it's called. And again, their interests wouldn't be served because they want those people to be, raising as much money as possible so they can have all of their far left priorities and all of their income redistribution happen as much as they possibly could wish. So that's, again, what I would say about labor unions in the public sector. So just a quick recap of what labor unions do in a general economy. And this is even, by the way, in the private sector where there is some level of competition. They act like a cartel. So they tend to result in 15 to 20% higher wages for their employees than for employees who are non-union in the same industry. But part of the reason for that is that they are essentially fleecing companies, and they also tend to operate and they tend to focus on the industries where there isn't a lot of competition, because they know that if there were an industry that was highly competitive, there just wouldn't be as many jobs and they might eventually go out of business. Even in competitive industries, they result in fewer jobs because it costs more to employ one union worker than it does to employ, one non-union worker. So in order to make, the optimal decision, the company will employ fewer union workers if it has to deal with a union than it would if those workers were not union workers. And also, again, compensation for top-level employees is actually lower under a union scheme because they would tend to be compensated much more highly than mediocre or underperforming employees in a non-union context. But because of the limits, and in fact sometimes the outright prohibition of conditioning compensation on performance in a union context, there's really not a lot of incentive to perform. And then those people who do want to perform highly often switch to a non-union context so that they can receive the benefits of their high performance, while the bad employees stick around in the union context and just prove to be a headache for the company that in many cases, because of the union, can't fire them. Another thing to note is basically what is a cartel in any other context? The railroads used to have cartels and collusion in, say, the late 1800s, early 1900s in the United States. We considered that, and I think rightfully so, a bad thing. Now, I'm not sure that I agree with the exact way in which the government went about punishing it. However, I do think it's worth noting that we recognize that it was a bad thing to have collusion and to have especially government-supported collusion, because a lot of those railroads were receiving large government benefits in the form of right-of-ways, eminent domain, etc. And in fact, sometimes even were given money to lay down the railroads. So I think in that case, the government could decide how they wanted to work with them. But why do we not apply the same standard to labor unions? Why do we not treat them as a cartel? Because that's what they are. They're just like, another example would be OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is a cartel that represents probably between 40 and 50% of oil production today, but used to represent a lot more before the shale oil revolution. And basically the idea they have is they want to reduce oil production and increase the price of oil in order to extract as much money from oil consumers as possible. I mean, that's anti-competitive behavior. That's not how a competitive economy works. And we recognize that we don't like OPEC. The issue is that we seem not to be able to apply that same standard to labor unions. And it's really unfortunate, it's dishonest, and I think it's bad for our country. The last thing I'd like to point out is just the coercive nature of labor unions, and just how it's not just enough that they can exist. They have to be able to pressure everybody into joining, and that means that even if you have workers who maybe aren't so interested in unionizing, you have to be able to pressure them and browbeat them until they comply and allow the union to come in, when that union is ostensibly there to support their interests as workers, but, really it only exists for itself. An example of this is the Employee Free Choice Act, which is a huge misnomer. It is not about free choice for employees at all. And instead, it is a proposed law that would entirely coerce employees by basically making their decision on how they vote up or down on a proposed unionization effort, making it public. The traditional method for a union organizing election is the secret ballot. That's the gold standard. That's what we have when we go to vote for politicians. When we go to vote in our elections, we have a secret ballot. That wasn't always the case. In fact, in the early history of the United States, when you went to vote, people would be watching you vote. They would see who you voted for. And in fact, often it was common practice to give that for the candidate for whom you voted, or for his people, his allies, to give you a swig of whiskey after you voted for him, or something like that. But there was also social sanction. People who wanted you to vote a different way than you did might punish you for it. In fact, Gouverneur Morris, one of the founding fathers, actually was concerned about having lower income people or non-property owners, which was a majority of even white men at the time, and certainly a majority of people, because again, very few women and very few non-white people owned any land. He only wanted property owners to vote, not because he didn't like the people who didn't own property, or not because he didn't think that they were worthy, but rather because he thought they would be under too much pressure to vote the interests of their employers. And again, this is because it wasn't a secret ballot. That's actually part of why we implemented a secret ballot eventually. We realized that in order for people to vote their actual interests without pressure from people who might have leverage over them, we needed to have a secret ballot. So similarly, it would make sense that a union election should be done through secret ballot. It would make perfect sense that truly if enough employees, if a majority of those employees at a factory or at maybe a restaurant or somewhere else wanted a union, if there were a secret ballot, they would know that they could vote for that union, and the company wouldn't be able to punish them individually. The company, you're not allowed to, legally, because of fair labor practices law, you're not allowed to punish or, exact retribution for union activity as a company. But even if they wanted to, even if they thought they could get around the law, they wouldn't know who to punish. So, the idea is that this should actually be a policy that unions like. The problem is that often unions aren't in the best interests of employees, and employees know that. Often a majority of employees don't want the hassle of having a union involved. Often the higher performing employees don't want to have a union involved to minimize the reward they have for their performance. Often some people, even the average employees, don't want to pay the dues, because in many cases unions don't really do enough to improve the lot of an employee to justify the dues that they charge. And for all these reasons, a lot of people will vote against unionization drives. In fact, I believe it may have been a year or two ago, there was a Volkswagen unionization drive at a Volkswagen factory, and I think it may have been South Carolina, I don't know, somewhere in the South. And the company even supported the union. They even wanted the unionization to happen. But the people in the factory decided not to unionize. They voted against unionization. And it's because, I'm guessing, a combination of the reasons I just mentioned. However, the Employee Free Choice Act, or the so-called Employee Free Choice Act, wants to take that away. They want to have a publicly signed card that each employee has to sign a card to describe or to offer his or her opinion on unionization, to say, do I want to unionize or do I not? And this is called card check, and here's the problem with that. It means that union organizers can pressure and harass workers who haven't signed the card in order to join the union. And here's the problem there. We say that companies are not allowed to pressure or harass the workers, so why are union organizers? I mean, in fact, I'm more of a libertarian on this thing. I think that companies should be able to punish people for creating a union that's going to cause them problems, but on the other hand, the workers, that they can organize, I think that's fine, make a contract, but also they shouldn't be specially protected in order to organize. But if we accept that that's how the law is written right now, and I think that's fair, at minimum, unions should not be able to pressure workers more than the companies can. They shouldn't be able to pressure workers when the companies can't do the same. And I think it also just shows how unions really don't exist for the well-being of workers as a whole, but only for the well-being of some incumbent workers and particularly underperforming incumbent workers. In any case, I'd like to close with an example of what happens to a union when that union bites off more than it can chew or when it demands too much. So one of the most famously, or I would argue infamously, unionized industries in United States history is the automotive industry. So the so-called Big Three, Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors, the famous, beloved American auto companies, tend to have union employees. And that's just because their professions were historically very profitable. A union was economically feasible, especially when foreign car companies weren't as present here in America. So, it's how it developed. And these people were typically getting paid about $70 an hour when you took into account not just their pay, but their benefits, their health insurance, their life insurance, all these other benefits they were getting. And for reference, that is between $140,000 and $150,000 a year, roughly. I just offered a little bit of a margin just in order to accommodate all the different possibilities, and especially the fact that they probably work a little bit of overtime during the year, but at least $145,000 and $145,600 if they're working every year, or $140,000 even if they have some weeks off. But they were getting paid so much that this just wasn't competitive with any other country's workers, but also even with non-union workers in America. So as companies like Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, and such came to America and started making things in America and abroad, in both cases, they were making cars so much more inexpensively than the big three that even with the fact that many Americans are patriotic and prefer their own American car companies, even then, there was not enough of that sentiment to overcome the massive differences in price that often came out of this tendency to overcompensate their employees. So just as an example, the gold-plated health benefits for United Auto Workers, which is the auto union, for their retirees and for their active workers added $1,200 to the cost of each vehicle that GM produced in 2007. What happened after 2007? There was a huge recession, and that meant that the federal government, arguably, maybe for good reasons, maybe not, bailed out two of the big three companies, Chrysler and GM. Ford didn't end up receiving the bailout, but it resolved differently. But in that case, then GM and Chrysler rather, had to follow federal rules, and that meant the federal government went in and basically forced the auto workers to cave, forced them to get rid of a lot of these ridiculous benefits that cost so much money. And the reason, effectively, it was a competition issue. Toyota and Hyundai, yes, their respective home governments are supportive of them, but they didn't need that kind of bailout because they were more competitive. They didn't have unions. They didn't have any of these problems that the unionized American auto workers had. So basically, the unionized American auto workers had to get a bailout, and because they had to get bailed out, they had to face the consequences. And in fact, the federal government did a lot of good things, even though maybe some would argue the bailouts maybe weren't the right thing to do. But regardless of whether they're the right thing to do or not, when they did take over those companies, they forced them to be more competitive. They said, hey, look, if you want to survive, you're going to be more competitive. And whenever you tell these auto workers that either you're going to do this or you're not going to have a job, that all of a sudden makes them more pliable. So I think it's important to see that it never should have gotten this far. There never should have had to have been a bailout. There never should have had to have been, government-dictated reductions in benefits. What really should have happened is that there should have been more opportunities for GM and for Chrysler and all these other companies like them in other industries even to fight against unionization before it got to this point, because that is not a healthy economic outcome. That is not a healthy outcome for workers or for anybody, really. I think if you look at that. So it's important, I think, to realize the unions created a big problem, and it's because they are coddled by our government. They play by a much cushier set of rules than the companies for which their workers work. So I think I rest my case by saying that they even cause problems in the private sector. Unions are not a good thing there, and I think large parts of the National Labor Relations Act, if not all of it, need to be, the Wagner Act, need to be repealed. And also, I would say, especially in public sectors, I definitely think that in the private sector, unions should be allowed to exist. They just shouldn't get special privileges. But in the public sector, unions should not be allowed to exist. Because in the current situation, and quite frankly, in any reasonable, conceivable situation, all the unions do in the public sector is effectively buy elected officials and then negotiate with those officials for unreasonable and unaffordable benefits that they don't deserve, and basically rules that make them almost impossible to fire, and that is all at the expense of the taxpayer. And that is part of why we're in so much debt, especially on the local and state level in many cases, and it's also part of why we have such poor federal services, because, again, the worst employees are always retained, and the better ones realize that they aren't going to be rewarded super well and go to the private sector where they can be better rewarded. Okay, that was a lot, and you guys are going to hopefully consider a lot of what I said, and then decide what you think about unions. I'd encourage you to read a lot more. There are a lot of perspectives on it. I certainly don't pretend to be the main expert on this, but I do definitely believe everything I said, and I hope you guys will consider that next time unions come up. With that, I thank you for listening, and from the Vanguard, George says, good afternoon, evening, or day, whatever time of day you are listening.